Good afternoon to everyone here on the live stream or either here in the room. We are still waiting for a few more participants, so we would give it another 2 minutes before we start this online discussion. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon or good day from wherever you are joining today's online discussion. Thank you very much for joining or watching. I'd like to welcome you all very much to this online discussion of our series on feminist strategies for gender just new normal. My name is Lydia Both, and I'm the new director of the Regional Political Feminism Program of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Before I say a few more words about the background of this online discussion and also on our organization, I'd like to just mention to everyone that this online discussion is being recorded and also live streamed. There's interpretation available for French and Arabic, and for the later online discussion where you can also post your questions, please feel free to choose whichever language you feel most comfortable with, English, French, or Arabic. But our inputs will be in English. Also, before I say a few more words on our foundation and also on the background of this webinar and the topic, I'd like us all to express our solidarity for today's general women's strike in the MENA region. Many of you might have heard of it. If not, I'm also encouraging you to inform yourselves. I'll post the links on the strikes where to get more information on here in the chat. Today there is a general women's strike in the MENA region amid the mounting number of femicides in the Middle East and North Africa, and the continued deliberate discrimination, exploitation, and marginalization of women in the region and everywhere else. We at FES, as well as all our partners present here today, support the strike and express our solidarity with the organizers and all women who are joining. We were also thinking about postponing this webinar due to the strike. However, due to upcoming Eid celebrations, this was not feasible. And I hope that you all understand. And I hope that through the webinar, we can also raise awareness on the issues around women, diversity, and gender, and how to tackle these from a feminist perspective, and thereby also support the cause of today's strike. Okay, who are we now? Who are the organizers of this webinar? The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung or Foundation, or FES in short, is the oldest political foundation of Germany with a rich tradition in social democracy, with offices both in Germany and all over the world. Its work dates back to 1925, and the foundation owes its formation and mission to the political legacy of its namesake, Friedrich Ebert, who was the first democratically elected German president. As said, the work of the foundation focuses very much on the core ideas and values of democracy, social democracy, freedom, justice, and solidarity, which are values that we believe align very much to the feminist movement. Therefore, in 2018, the Regional Project on Political Feminism was established in Beirut, It's regional because we focus on the Middle East and North Africa. We work with our feminist partners, feminist activists, women's rights organizations on advancing gender justice advocacy and mainstreaming intersectional feminist approaches and principles with a focus on specifically feminist economics, repoliticizing feminist movements and activism across the region, and gender justice. We also just launched our new website, which is available in English, French, and Arabic. And I encourage you very much to look at the website to also learn more about our work. I'll post it in the chat as well for your information. Yeah, and today's session is a second online discussion around feminist strategies in a post-COVID new normal. Our first online discussion, which you might have also joined, focused on gender-based violence in the region and how feminist strategies can contribute to combat gender-based violence. Today, we would like to look with our speakers into strategies, feminist strategies for a post-COVID economic recovery in the region. As we are all aware and as we are all experiencing ourselves, most likely, the outbreak of COVID-19 shed light on already existing inequalities and made them even more starkly visible, not only in the region, but all over the world. Lockdown measures that were taken by governments to contain the pandemic had varying effects on individuals and communities from different class, age, ethnicities, gender, and sexuality. Within the context of the MENA region, existing patriarchal structures were already hindering women's and minorities' access to rights and opportunities and services. And then the pandemic itself and the measures taken in many cases worsened this. The measures might have reduced the spread and contain the economic impact in general, the economic impact of the pandemic, but very often these measures remained very gender blind and failed to take into consideration the already existing gender inequalities. Now that vaccines have been developed and distributed, even if that in itself also very unequally, we are entering a, well, often referred to as a post-COVID reality. However, as also we discussed internally just now, COVID is still very much a reality. It's just that by now we are adapting to this new normal. And if we do not apply feminist strategies for rethinking how to structure this new normal and how to rethink existing economic, social, and political structures, then all the listed inequalities will persist. Therefore, we invite you all to discuss today what feminist strategies could look like to especially to implement economic recovery measures. And when we look at the region, we realize that over the past decade, countries across the region have been subject to austerity policies where governments reduced budgets which were allocated for social spending, including issues like social protection, health, and education. As a result, the pandemic had disproportionate economic impacts on various groups with the richest, accumulating even more wealth, and individuals and groups from middle and low socioeconomic classes having less access to income as well as to public services and social protection. And as so often, women who mostly work in the informal sector or in the underpaid or even unpaid care work suffered the most. And have been severely impacted by the pandemic. Very often governments' responses failed to take this into consideration, the gendered impact of the pandemic. So today, as said, we invite our speakers and then all of you to think about, give examples, and also discuss possible feminist economic strategies for the recovery during the period that is now following the pandemic, or that is now the period in the new normal where we are adapting to living with the pandemic. strategies that ensure redistribution of wealth and that value unpaid labor and care work. With this, I would like to introduce you to our moderator for today's session, Ms. Sama Kricha. She is a program officer at Kvinna till Kvinna. It's a foundation or a Swedish women's rights organization, and Samha is based in Tunisia. Sama's work focuses on civil society and international organizations covering issues such as security sector reform, transitional justice, social cohesion, gender, peace, and security. Her focus, or her regional focus, is very much on Tunisia and the overall MENA region in general. She holds a master's in women, peace, and security studies from the LSE. We have two speakers with us today, Farah and Diana, who Samha will introduce in more detail in a second. Just wanted to mention that they are both based in Lebanon, and as you might have heard, Lebanon is undergoing a severe economic crisis like many other countries, but for specific reasons that also goes along with a crisis in energy and electricity, and there are very often electricity cuts. We really hope that we don't lose them during the webinar, but I would ask you for your understanding if there might be some hiccups due to electricity issues. We also announced the third speaker. However, she is not available to join this call today as she's joining the general women's strike that I mentioned in the beginning. And with this, I would hand over to Samha. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to moderate this very interesting, actually, webinar that is interesting to us as feminists, but also as organizations working on feminist economy. And I would like to express my solidarity with the feminist strike today. It is super important that we show solidarity and that we can keep to the fight in different on different levels. I guess you summarized very, very well the situation right now, but I would like to go back and just give a few words on the situation and how the COVID-19 pandemic changed our lives and put us in this new normal, especially disproportionately affecting women who had their lives upside down with increased burden of unproductive work, and where many of them had to leave their jobs or cut their working hours. Many of the women found themselves, who are working in the informal sector, found themselves obliged to quit or don't have any more income. So this is the situation now. And this webinar intends at thinking and suggesting feminist strategies for economic recovery in the MENA region moving forward, but more specifically learning from the lessons of the pandemic and calling for solidarity that we can contextualize to the context of the MENA region. Our experts today will tackle a variety of issues touching upon macroeconomic structures and strategies regionally and in the different countries. So please join me in welcoming Diana Callas, who is Oxfam's and MENA's Senior Inequality Policy Advisor with over a decade of experience advising ministries, INGOs, and civil society organizations on labor rights and social and economic reforms in Lebanon and the Arab region. And also Farah Hashemi, who is a research fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative. Farah's work focuses on Arab youth trajectories in context of conflict, social protection in the post-COVID-19 era in the Arab region, and the role of new labor movements in transitions in Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, and Algeria, among others. Her previous research work covered a wide array of economic development, political economy, and political sociology topics in the Arab region, from tax justice, informal labor, gender policies, and public-private partnerships, to inequalities, implementation of the 2030 Agenda, transitional social movements, governance, and civil society. So I would like to kindly ask our speakers today to give us a snapshot of the economic situations in the different countries of the MENA region, but also on the region, especially affecting women in the post-COVID-19. If you can start, Diana, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Samah, and thank you to the FES team for inviting us to join this talk. Before I start, also would love to express my solidarity with the women's strike movement happening today. And I hope that this discussion also contributes to raising the voice. I just want to ask you, Samah, before I start, that if I overstep the time limit, if you can just tell me in the last minute, orally, because I'm surely not going to notice on the chat. Thank you.
I will, for sure.
Okay, so let me start speaking of the situation, the economic situation today, by this simple statistic. The 10 richest men in the world today have more than doubled their fortunes during the pandemic. The 10 richest men, because the 10 richest people in the world today are men. Although we don't want more people to be billionaires, and the point is not to have more women billionaires, the idea is that the capitalistic system today is very much a patriarchal system. And so whenever we speak of a feminist agenda, we are speaking of a progressive agenda, of a socialist agenda, of an ecofeminist agenda. These are tightly linked. And so I would like to speak to you today about specifically debt and austerity and how they impact women in our region today. Starting first with some global statistics. In the last 25 years, the richest 1% of people in the world concentrate more global wealth than the bottom half of humanity. 1% versus 50%. And every day we have 21,000 people dying from inequality. Oxfam recently issued a report under the title of Inequality Kills, because every 4 seconds we have people dying from inequality based on factors such as poverty, lack of access to health, climate, and gender-based violence. And the estimates that we are providing are very strict estimates. We consider that especially gender-based violence is supposed to be leading to even more death than what we could account for. During the COVID pandemic, there was an explosion of inequality worldwide. There was more accumulation of wealth in the first 2 years of the pandemic than in the last 14 years altogether. There was a bonanza. This was a bonanza for billionaires. The 10 richest men in the world more than doubled their fortunes in the pandemic, as I mentioned. And we discovered through our research that taxing wealth could substantially lead to alleviating the situation of most people around the world. Inequality is a political choice. We need to tax the ultra-rich, and we need to claw back a lot of the gains, a lot of the wealth that was accumulated specifically during the COVID pandemic. And a core part of today's capitalist model is focused around people in poverty, women and girls and racialized groups being disproportionately affected by inequality and by the general model. Moving to the MENA region more specifically. In 2021, billionaire wealth in the MENA region increased by 23% during the pandemic and there was a drop in the wealth of the bottom 90% of people. The 3 richest people in the MENA region own more wealth than the bottom 40%. This is how unequal our region is. And our studies showed that if we had an annual wealth tax on millionaires and billionaires, this would be enough to increase health spending across the region by 50%, or to eliminate entirely out-of-pocket health spending, which is a big issue that we all suffer from. So this is the general context that that we are looking at when we're speaking of what is the economic situation and how it affects women in particular. So going more specifically to the issue of debt and austerity, which is for us the main reason leading to poverty and inequality globally and in the MENA region. We have a huge problem of public debt in the region, with countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Jordan having public debt that is around 90% of their GDP. Lebanon's public debt is more than twice the size of its economy, with the economic situation that you are all aware of. And that is a political choice. And it is being coupled with austerity measures, especially in countries that are under IMF-led structural adjustment programs, which are geared towards reducing the size of the public sector, boosting private sector-led growth, coupled with poverty alleviation. So instead of having an economic model that is inclusive and equal, we have an economic model that leads to wealth accumulation. And in parallel, we have poverty alleviation, cash transfer programs that only lead to ad hoc, on-the-spot solutions instead of sustainable structural solutions to inequality and poverty. The austerity policies that we're talking about are related to a decrease in social spending, especially on health and education. This leads to much more increased out-of-pocket health expenditure to people. There's also a reduction in the public wage bill, a lifting of oil and food subsidies, and these are all measures that affect vulnerable people and women specifically. For instance, when we speak about subsidies, lifting subsidies, this affects women who rely on oil for cooking, for care work. When we speak of electricity bills, similarly, these are measures that affect women's daily life, especially that women are those who take care of household and care work the most. So this is added to indirect taxation, like increases in VAT or removal of exemptions to VAT on basic goods. And this is also proven to increase economic and gender inequality. So these issues are either issues that we find in a country like Lebanon that is still, until today, not under an IMF program, or in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, or Morocco, who have been under IMF programs for a long time, and in which the IMF has played a very important role in driving such austerity measures. Generally, international financial institutions have contributed to a general dominant narrative that is austerity-driven, and that speaks of this neoliberal model of austerity measures as the one and only solution to economic problems that are being faced by our societies. The truth is, these economic issues are mostly linked to to this situation of political capture and inequality, with a minority of people in power who are having a very strong hold on political decision and economic decisions. And so even if in some countries you don't have IMF-led programs, the general dominant narrative is still very much affected by IFI-led economic discourse. Now, moving forward, austerity policies are also affecting women because they are coupled with a certain approach to labor force participation. For instance, instead of tackling issues of decent work conditions, safe work environment, salaries, national childcare systems, there's an approach of capacity building, of increasing private sector women's labor participation. But the truth is, with unsafe work environments, with unreliable, unsafe transportation systems, with the private sector still not matching women's skill sets, we see that women often tend to work in the public sector. And so when you have austerity measures that reduce the wage bill of the public sector, that reduce the size of the public sector, you are directly affecting women as well. And so here again, we need to shift to an approach to policy making, an approach to adjustment programs that look at what impact economic recovery has on women. I will stop now and leave this part to the next session where we discuss feminist strategies for recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. This was a great overview of the situation. And I would like to encourage the audience to keep their questions and comments for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And please use the chat box for that. Now I will hand the floor to Farah, who will give us a more detailed in-country overviews with examples on the economic situation. And yeah, please, Farah, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Samah. Thank you to the FES team. It's a pleasure to be among you today. Thanks for inviting us. And thank you, Diana, for this very clear and comprehensive overview. And I'm so glad, I was so happy to hear Diana, because actually what I'm going to be mentioning now is a projection of what Diana mentioned about neoliberalism, capitalism, and internal governance and political economy issues affecting gender equality. What I'm going to be mentioning is actually a projection of this macro overview on a more meso and micro level. And to begin with, or before I actually start, I'd like to highlight the importance of our discussion today. And I think it is particularly important for three key reasons. First of all, the status quo of women and of LGBTQ communities, which we do not forget about, we should not also forget about, was already bad before COVID, irrespective of the COVID pandemic. And this, if we look, I mean, from a human rights-based point of view, from a socioeconomic rights point of view, from all perspectives, it was actually bad. And COVID only came to exacerbate that and to exacerbate gender discrimination and gender vulnerabilities. The second reason is that despite all of this, there was a continuity and not a rupture in the public policy patterns. And this is what our research at the Arab Reform Initiative and the Arab Hub for Social Protection from COVID, now shifting its name to Arab Hub for Social Protection, has shown. It has shown that indeed there was no continuity, that there was a continuity and not a rupture in the public policy pattern. And this was coupled with other consecutive and overlapping crises in several countries of the region, which I'm going to be talking about later. And it was also coupled with closed policy spaces, with a shrinking space for civil society, with accentuated austerity measures, as mentioned by Diana, and subsequently a decrease in social spending for dealing, and I mean the austerity measures and the decrease in social spending, in addition to to having a neoliberal background, they were for a major reason, which is that our governments have dealt with the pandemic as a health crisis, as a sanitary crisis, and they chose not to deal with it as an economic crisis, with social repercussions that are very serious and that need to be addressed. The third reason is that the social and gender repercussions of the COVID pandemic are still persisting to date, and we are still living them. And these cannot be addressed or tackled without serious interventions. They cannot be addressed or tackled with the prevailing no policy or with the prevailing policy inaction that comes from the lack of political will to change and to change for the best. So this is just to put things into perspective. Now, my entry point to discussing issues related to gender justice always is twofold. That is first the explicit gender discrimination, and then there is the implicit forms of gender discrimination that we should be somehow looking into. To begin with, explicitly speaking, explicit gender discrimination is clearly expressed or directly expressed in discrepant policies and laws. For example, I'm going to start by giving examples. The inheritance law in Egypt, affecting Egyptian rural women who have a history of long struggle with recuperating or trying to claim their inheritance in terms of property, in terms of agricultural lands, and in terms of wealth. The same applies in Morocco, for example, with al-Mar'a al-Sulaliya, or the dynastic women, if the translation is correct, but the interpreters will do definitely a better job, who have been suffering a lot in terms of access to natural resources and to agricultural land and to their properties on this level. Explicit gender discrimination can also manifest on the level of social security funds. For example, in many Arab countries, we are very blind to the fact that although single mothers are rare in Lebanon, but they do exist, and they need particular support and particular social protection coverage. They are also blind to the fact that, for example, when the woman or the mother is the head of the household or the main breadwinner for so many reasons, and reasons are many in the region, given it is conflict afflicted, when the mother is the main breadwinner or the head of a household, she has to go through a very hectic, tiring process to prove that, whereas men do not have to prove that to be able to cover their children, cover their wives, etc. This situation is better, to give credit to a couple of governments, it is better somehow in Tunisia and Morocco, but it is still not as satisfactory as it should be. Explicit gender discrimination also happens in the labor codes when it comes to maternity benefits, maternity leaves, to the differential impact of not necessarily the differential impact, but the differences or the discrepancies on the level of compensations and salaries between men and women. And for example, in the bankruptcy law, because just recently, only a few months before the pandemic hit, there was an amendment to the bankruptcy law in Lebanon, for example. Before that, the government used to give its right to put its hands or to confiscate the woman's wealth and properties in case her husband goes bankrupt, whereas the opposite was not true. And there was some amendments in explicit forms of discrimination related to sexual harassment, to rape, but these remain shy. And I say that they are shy because there is a very high sense of entitlement on the part of the governments towards these, because these are very primitive amendments that should have happened a long time ago. But now they do them, and they portray them as an achievement or as a big progress, and it is not the case. Now, more important than that, I have to say, is the implicit or indirect forms of gender discrimination. Women and the LGBTQ communities are initially more marginalized and more vulnerable, relatively speaking. This makes them more susceptible to shocks, any form of shock, whether economic, oil price shock, food price shock, whatever form of economic and also socioeconomic shocks. And this makes them more susceptible to every single unjust socioeconomic public policy, to tax injustice, to trade injustice, to all forms of public policies that are not just. And here stems the implicit forms of gender discrimination. I'm going to now start by giving some figures by the ILO, ESQA, and UN Women to somehow, I don't need to prove that, especially after Diana's presentation, but it would be good to actually capture how vulnerable and marginalized women are initially on the baseline, even before any form of pandemic or shock whatsoever. First of all, the Arab region has the world's lowest rate of female labor force participation, as Diana mentioned. And to mention the number, it is 18.4% compared to the global average of 48%. By contrast, if we look at male labor force participation, it is at 77%, which is higher than the world's average of 75%. The second figure I'd like to mention is related to female unemployment, which is at 15.6%, i.e. 3 times higher than the world's average. Also, women are not empowered at all, not only politically, but also economically, because women in managerial positions, the rate of women in managerial positions is very low in the region, with 11% only of women in managerial positions compared to the world's average of 27%. More so, unpaid childcare work at home is resulting in women having to spend almost 5 times more hours than men on unpaid care work. And care work in general, including unpaid care work, isn't accounted for in our GDPs to begin with, and isn't accounted for by the governments to begin with. And this is also leading into the difference not only in compensations or salaries, but also in the difference in the hours of work, the amount of hours worked between men and women in the absolute. Also, women in the Arab region have much less access to electricity, to the internet, to all sorts of technical infrastructure and also public services. And I'm going to only mention one figure that comes from Iraq, which is not an outlier, by the way, but because the figure captured or caught my attention a lot. In Iraq alone, 98.3% of men have access to the internet compared to only 51.2% of women who have access to the internet. And this matters a lot when we're talking about COVID and the post-COVID era. Now, the coronavirus outbreak has led to an unprecedented increase of 1.3 percentage points, and not percent, in the unemployment rate in non-GCC Arab states. So I have taken these out to be able to take out all outliers. And it has left 39 million individuals working in hard-hit sectors, such as services and tourism, which are the backbone of our rentier economies, as Diana mentioned earlier. Can you, I received the message saying that my connection is bad. Can you now hear me, or is it still? Okay, cool, thank you.
It's
okay, thank you so much, I'm glad. So I was saying that 39 million individuals have become working in are working in hard-hit sectors during the COVID pandemic, such as services and tourism, which are the biggest sectors of our rentier economies in the Arab region. As a result, women have lost over 700,000 jobs just during the pandemic. And this is big. This is a big number. This is very significant. And women also had to work at home and had to shift to remote work, and had to shift to the digital economy, although they do not have access to the internet, to the basic infrastructure that they need, and although they have to do all of this unpaid care work at home. And this is something that we have to take into consideration, in addition to the fact that all sorts of public services that are essential for women have been hard hit by the pandemic. Also, in addition to that, women, due to the barriers to entry into the labor markets in the Arab region.
Interrupt, Farah. You still have 1 minute maximum. Thank you.
Yes, I'll try then to wrap up. And I'll skip a couple of points. I was just trying to say that women are very engaged in the informal economy, and informal employment represents 68% of total employment prior to COVID. And not only with unpaid care work, but also they are engaged with paid care work. We can name here as examples migrant domestic workers, we can name nurses and midwives and support medical staff. Women are at the very bottom of the employment pyramid in the health sector, which makes them even more susceptible because the health workers were very much exposed to the COVID-19 pandemic. They were also part of the gig economy, which is very much of a gendered space. And now our research has shown that in addition to the seen or known forms of vulnerability that intersect with gender vulnerability, such as people with disabilities, children, youth, and the elderly, that are not only age groups, but are also risks or contingencies, such as migrants, undocumented migrants and refugees, informal labor, rural populations. COVID has also exposed new forms of vulnerability. And here I'm going to have to mention what new forms of vulnerability have arose due to COVID. Urban populations, given air pollution in urban cities, people living in slums and informal settlements, which are highly populated, which are very unsanitary environments, people with respiratory diseases. In Egypt, we discovered that women working in the private sector, exceptionally, became worse off as compared to women working in the public sector, because interventions aiming at supporting women through the pandemic were restricted to public sector employees in the case of Egypt. Also in particular cases of the global south, including in many Arab regions, the formal sector employees have become better off because they had more flexibility to circumvent and they had better mobility, given that the responses to the pandemic were highly militarized and securitized and full of lockdowns and
15 seconds.
2 seconds, okay. I'm going to also mention something, and maybe I can continue with this discussion in addition to the prescriptive part at a later stage. But just to mention briefly that in addition to these new forms of vulnerability that intersect with gender, COVID has exposed invisible forms of vulnerability. And here I'd like to give an example from Tunisia. The invisible forms of vulnerability are vulnerabilities that we've never seen before, because we could not identify or reach these women. And they belong to different forms of ecosystem. They belong to the urban places, to marine places, to forests. And these have their specific livelihoods means, their specific life conditions. They suffer from mobility injustice to a large extent, and they are extremely marginalized. And these intersect indeed as well with gender discrimination. In the prescriptive part, I'll make sure to cover the points that I did not manage to cover, and to jump into proposing alternatives and a clear set of recommendations to be able to see how we can address these forms of vulnerabilities that intersect with gender, and gender vulnerability on its own as a standalone form of discrimination. Sorry for taking longer.
It's okay. Thank you so much, Farah and Diana, and thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview that lays the ground for our next discussion. And what I take away from both your presentations is the intersectionality of the causes of this economic crisis that we are going through, and the lack of political/economic will to change things. So our next session will focus more on what strategies can we push for as feminists and as people working in this field and as grassroots organizations to influence this lack of political will and to raise more awareness about the issues that we've talked about, both on the regional level and on the national levels. So if you'd like Diana to start.
Thank you. Sure. There are so many different angles to this question, but I will continue with the same logic that I started with, which is the political economy and the economic models perspective. So what we're looking at today is how to build back better. So how to take the opportunity of this crisis to work on shifting towards a new reality. And so from my perspective, feminist strategies for economic recovery need to go through a shift in the economic model, which entails a shift in the balance of power in society and a shift in the dominant narrative. So when we talk about shifting the economic model, we're talking about shifting from rentier economies to productive economies, shifting from austerity to increased public spending, from regressive taxation to progressive taxation, shifting from poverty alleviation to universal social protection, shifting from privatization to free, quality public health, education, and transportation, shifting from real estate bubbles to rights-driven housing policies, shifting from GDP growth models to multidimensional indicators that reflect the realities of well-being in society, and finally shifting from trade liberalization to a serious discussion around food sovereignty and an eco-feminist agenda. So these are the titles that I would like to propose to sort of give a framework to the discussion on feminist perspectives on economic recovery. Because every one of those points affects women directly. Because by solving the issue, the question of inequality, we are directly solving much of the structural issues that affect women's daily realities. As I mentioned before, an annual tax in the MENA region is possible, and we need to end the myth of austerity and start or stop making a taboo out of wealth taxation. And here as well, whenever we speak of IMF interventions, the IMF policies need to integrate issues of inequality and redistribution and gender in all of its interventions in the MENA region. This is crucial because we need to assess the impacts of macroeconomic policies on the condition of vulnerable groups and on the condition of women in particular before we adopt and implement them. Very importantly, care work must be at the heart of a feminist recovery agenda. Before the pandemic already, women suffered from the unequal nature of unpaid care and domestic work. Globally, also before the pandemic, 42% of women of working age said that they were unable to do paid work because of their unpaid care work and domestic work responsibility, compared to just 6% of men. And this is according to a study conducted globally by Oxfam in 5 different countries. The pandemic response increased unpaid care workloads for both women and men, especially lockdowns. Around half of women that were surveyed in this study reported that they are spending more time on unpaid care and domestic work as a result of COVID measures. And this has direct consequences on their health, on their economic security, on their well-being, and on the well-being of their families. And this impact is most tangible and much higher among women in lower income countries and women within lower income groups. And this can be explained by lack of basic services, basic infrastructure, from electricity to house supplies that make life easier, basically. And so the less access to quality equipment and infrastructure that you risk having, the higher your risk of suffering from higher hours of unpaid work. And so there needs to be an approach that recognizes unpaid and underpaid care work, that reduces hours spent on household chores, that redistributes unpaid care work fairly within the household, but also, more importantly, shifts the responsibility of care to the state and to the private sector, And finally, that represents the most marginalized caregivers and ensures that their voices are heard whenever policies are being designed and implemented. Now, to go back to, so this is the general approach. There is so much more to talk about, but I will stop at this general idea with a focus on care. And so that was about shifting the economic model. But shifting the economic model means in order to do that, we need to shift the power to the people. So we need to shift policy making from private interests of ruling elites to the public interest. And this entails working with trade unions, working on widening the civic space, freedom of expression, labor rights, and also working on the financing of media and democracy that has a big role to play in where the weight of power lies. Just to conclude, I think there can be no free societies without free women. When I was preparing this presentation, I thought I would say there can be no empowered societies without empowered women, but I don't like the word empowered. I feel it's a bit neo-colonial. So let's say no free societies without free women, but also no free women without free societies as well. We need to reclaim the narrative in order to reclaim power. So let's together tell a new story in order to reach a new social contract. And this new story, we need to design it together, and it has to be based around not empowered, but strong and free image of women in our region. And this needs to start by expanding the space to voice and to manifest our will and our interests as individuals and as a collective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. Absolutely no free society without free women, and no equality without democracy. So Farah, if you can continue the amazing strategies that Diana started.
Yeah, of course, and I'll try not to take more time this time. So I think it is actually also very, very important that we are starting to think about a post-COVID economic recovery strategy. But that is not because we have moved into a post-COVID era. As I'm talking to you now, I'm a suspected COVID case. This shouldn't be the rationale behind our discussion. It is because we need to go back to our understanding how our economic models, how our development paradigms, how our social contracts, social fabrics, political red lines have all shaped our national orders, our institutions, public and private, and our social protection systems in a certain way to make them react with the pandemic the way they did, and to make them subsequently exacerbate multidimensional inequality that Diana just portrayed the way they did, including gender disparities. And this is particularly important because we have to start thinking beyond the scope of the pandemic in order to build more resilient systems, more resilient economic systems that make us resilient to any future shock. And the biggest proof that this is the rationale that we should be adopting is the Ukraine war and its repercussions on food security, on food sovereignty, which also has a very major gender dimension to take into consideration. So by going back to the initial baseline before COVID, to build the resilience, to build back better indeed, and to build the resilient systems that we need, this is how we can make sure that in any future pandemic in the future, or in any future shock, we can be ready to cope. So neoliberalism has co-opted the feminist discourse indeed, and it has politicized it. And it has also restricted the gender justice dimension to issues of human rights, all while disregarding the issues of the cultural component, other issues, related to socioeconomic policies per se that we are talking about today. And that is because the neoliberal economic models and the feminist discourse are based on very contradictory core fundamentals. So no wonder why. What we need now, if we are to prescribe a strategy for recovery, for a post-COVID recovery, what we need is a clear and feasible macroeconomic structural plan for recovery and stabilization. But that is only for the short and medium term. This plan has to prepare us for a shift to a new economic model that is indeed productive and not rentier, and a new development paradigm in the longer term. So we need the macroeconomic structural plan for recovery and stabilization for short and medium term, and then a new economic model on the longer term. And that is by, instead of focusing on the parameters of the market economy, laissez-faire, laissez-passer, and on maximizing economic growth and on creating more jobs, we need to focus on the quality of the growth, of economic growth. We need to focus on the quality and distribution of jobs and on the redistribution instead of the mobilization of resources and of wealth. And for this to happen, it has to be, or for this redistribution instead of resource mobilization, it has to be internal. And it does not have to be based on indebtedness. It does not have to be based on external resources that create the vicious circle of inequality internally. And we also need controls over prices, over capital flows, over FDIs. Second, what we need is, instead of adopting the private-led strategies that we've always seen in our neoliberal systems, we need to rebuild our public institutions and reform our governance systems in order to allow for the states to do that, for the states to provide the public services that we need, for them to provide the social protection that we need. This is how we can create social justice in general, and therefore address the implicit or indirect form of gender discrimination that we are living. What we also need more on a more pragmatic or practical level is to mainstream gender in all the dimensions of the development agenda, and subsequently in all of our public policies, be it trade policies, tax policies, etc. And I'm gonna go into details more. But when I speak about the development agenda, I mean, for instance, the biggest development agenda that exists now, which is the Agenda 2030, and the SDGs, the 17 SDGs that it has. If we think about gender when we're speaking about goal 1, poverty, goal 2, hunger, 3, health, 4, education, 8, decent work, 6, water, even when we're speaking about environmental justice, etc. When we're speaking about this is how we can mainstream gender in order to become not only gender aware, because we are all gender aware. What we need to become is gender sensitive, responsive, and most importantly, transformative. Now, this is a very big agenda. It's a multi-dimensional agenda. But for me, the key priorities or the key interventions, if I am to think of a priority list of interventions, includes on the very top tax justice. We need to think about tax justice. We need direct taxes to be progressive, because this, again, this is an informal form of gender discrimination or an implicit form of gender discrimination that it entails if they are regressive. We need also the indirect taxes to be progressive, and we need the indirect taxes to be on the goods and to be law on the goods and services that are consumed by women the most. For example, food, beverages, the milk for kids, contraceptives, period sanitary kits, all of these are proven by so many studies, from the Progressa study in Mexico moving forward, that women spend more on these key basic essential services. Therefore, indirect taxes need to be lowered on these and increased on cigarettes, on alcohol, on yachts. What we are facing in the Arab region is totally the opposite. We also need to think of pink taxes. If we take the very basic example of a razor, if it is pink and designed for women and for women use, it becomes the price doubles. These have to be addressed. We also need to think about real estate taxes that need to be increased, about capital gain taxes, and all other forms of wealth taxes that were indeed mentioned by Diana during her presentation. We also need to think about the collection part, the tax collection. We have to stop tax avoidance, tax evasions. We have to create clear mechanisms for these to stop. And we have to also, be clear about what forms of tax exemptions and tax deductions we should be providing to women, to what women, when, and where. And we also have to think about the illicit financial flows, because all of this waste of resources is reflecting into social inequality and subsequently into gender inequality. The second priority area of intervention is trade justice. Diana indeed mentioned trade liberalization, and I think this is very important because the rationale in our countries is for trade to be export-led, for our production, if we produce, because we are rentier economies, when we produce, it is, even in the agricultural sector, it is mostly export-led. We need to think more about what we import, what we export, and we need to increase tariffs on the products that are produced locally to begin with, and that are produced by women more particularly, whether industrial and agricultural products. And that's not at all similar to what's already happening in terms of small-scale interventions with the SMEs, for example. No, we need to think more on a grosso modo level, what women are producing, what women are consuming, and therefore manage or decide on the tax and tariff rates accordingly. And here also, or the implementation of this particular point prevails on the level of the trade agreements. We have the deep and comprehensive trade agreements in Tunisia. We have the WTO as well. Now we have the COMESA and the Continental Agreement happening on the level of trade. The third level of intervention is related, that I consider a priority because there are many, is related to gender responsive budgeting. And for this to happen, we need social audits or gender audits, and we are lacking the both. We do not have social audits, we do not have gender audits, and we have everything but a gender responsive budgeting. Like even in countries like Lebanon, we are not updating our budgets and we are not rethinking our budgets as often and as frequently as we should. Gender responsive budgeting is what will reflect on the public services and on the social spending in a way that is gender sensitive and responsive enough. Gender equality and responsiveness in the labor codes is key. Legal frameworks to include the informal labor, which are part of why, in addition to the unpaid care work and paid care work that women are very much engaged in, are also these legal frameworks need indeed to be put in order for us to be able to be more fair towards women and the LGBTQ community. And we need also legal frameworks and transparency and accountability mechanisms for the private sector, which we cannot deny that it is a key component or key actor in development. And for it to have corporate social responsibility and for it to be gender friendly, it has to be bound by transparency and accountability mechanisms. We cannot just rely on the ethics of the profit-oriented business owners who are often intertwined with the political elite in the Arab region. If we create this economic model and development paradigm that is very just socially and more particularly gender. Yes, awesome. So awesome, because I feel like I will be able to finalize my very last point on time. So if we build this economic model and development paradigm in a way that is socially just, that is gender just, then social protection comes to complement it. We cannot speak about social protection if we do not have this very solid basis that provides us with social justice. And here we need to revamp indeed our social protection systems so that they become universal, inclusive, effective, and indeed sustainable and not ad hoc or surgical. And that is by providing core life cycle coverage and social protection floors to everybody while leaving no one behind. That is by providing universal health coverage, by not forgetting education, given how important it is, by providing unemployment insurance, maternity, pension plans, and so on and so forth. And social protection systems that are universal and state-led can later be complemented by targeted cash transfers, by food assistance, in-kind donations, social grants, especially in crisis times, just so until we have wage adjustments and the price adjustments and the coping mechanisms that any market needs to go through a certain phase in order to reach them. And the feasibility-wise, these social protection reforms that I'm mentioning, in addition to the safety nets or poverty alleviation reforms, for them to be feasible, it has again to be through an internal redistribution of wealth and not through indebtedness and external resources. I have a couple of points that I can probably add during the Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Farah. We can continue talking about this forever, since there is so much to do and so much to do at so many levels, and that need to be reflected both at the very macro level, but also at micro and national levels. I would like to encourage participants to this webinar to ask their questions. So you can raise your hands or ask your questions in the chat box. And I actually have a question for our experts today. So you presented many ideas for strategies and ways to get out of this crisis, but also to reflect on a very, very deep level and from scratch on how our policies are made and how they need to be reflected. And as Farah said, we need a social and gender audits for gender responsive budgeting, but also for social protection and all strategies you suggested. So how do you think we can, as civil society, raise awareness and gather more women around macroeconomic issues and have a more bottom-up approach, in the sense that women and feminist organizations and the feminist movement in general usually think that economy is a very far and inaccessible topic. So how, from your experience, we can make governments listen to our feminist requests regarding effective, inclusive, and equal economic reforms?
I don't know if Diana would like to go first, or
Go ahead, Farah. Yalla. I'll jump in next.
All right. So actually, I will mention 2 points in response to this question, and I believe it is a very important question. First of all, there are existing mechanisms of advocacy and channels of advocacy that we should pursue, whether we like the institutions that have provided us with these platforms or not, whether we like the international financial institutions that are providing us with these platforms and the political parties, be it traditional or alternative and independent or not, they have these mechanisms and we should pursue them. And I'm saying that because if we avoid pursuing these advocacy mechanisms, we risk having other civil society representatives that are not actually our representatives and that do not really capture our aspirations and our discourse and our goals. We risk having them represent us and speak on our behalf and derail the policy advocacy process. That is the very first point. And here I have to mention that we need to admit that when Christine Lagarde was the managing director of the IMF, the CSO Policy Forum, as an example, that the IMF has provided during the annual and the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, was a very, very, for example, essential advocacy channel whereby civil society representatives went, hosted panels, external events, met with the IMF executive directors, discussed, and this has led to a major adjustment or amendment, if I were to say, in the feminist strategy that Christine Lagarde has worked on. Is it enough? Probably not. Is it being put into practice and implemented? Maybe not. Is the IMF being a hypocrite in terms of the strategy they are proposing versus what they are doing on the ground? Probably yes, but we need to do our best. This is my very first point. Now, regarding my second point, it's related to how we incentivize people to participate politically and economically, but also to participate in our research and policy asks that are targeted towards them. And this is by, and especially when we're speaking about research, it's all about how we localize our knowledge production, how we adopt a mixed method approach, whereby not only we produce the data, because the policymakers look at data and look at a clear set of recommendations, but this data and these sets of recommendations do not really capture the reality of women, and particularly of vulnerable women and of vulnerable groups. We need to complement these by qualitative research methods that are localized and that are tailored to our Arab communities. We need to do ethnographic field work. We need to do peer ethnography. We need to speak to these vulnerable groups, because even though this might lead to anecdotal evidence and stories, these anecdotal evidence are what speaks to the people and are what should come to complement the data that we are usually presenting to the policymakers, to be able to provide a more of a disaggregated picture and thus make the bigger impact that we want. And when we speak about the data, going back to the data, we also need to think about indicators that are more creative, that are more out of the box. We cannot, for example, when we want to speak about health and gender, we cannot rely on the typical indicator that international organizations use, which is like the percentage of public spending on health out of the total budget or out of the total public spending. This is not enough, because even if the public spending is indeed high percentage-wise, the distribution of this public spending on health might not be fair enough. So we need to think of more tailored indicators to the cases that or to the target groups and to the target communities that are impacted, and that we really have to try to help by adopting a mixed method approach, and indeed decolonizing the approach we adopt in research, in practice, and in policy related processes and advocacy.
Thank you so much, Farah. Do you want to say anything about this, Diana, before we go to the questions that you have in the question box?
Yes, if I may, I agree with what Farah just said. There's much to be done in terms of advocacy on these issues. And I just shared a report that we worked on at Oxfam around the issue of shifting narratives around inequality and political capture in the MENA region. And it includes a set of recommendations, among which recommendations related to her last point on statistics and indicators. And that's very, very important and crucial in order for us to shift our perspective. But I would like to add just a different dimension to this, which is women need to get political. We live in one of the most highly conflict-ridden, low on civic space, undemocratic regions in the world. And we are here, most of us, as members of civil society in this region, because we found no place in the public administrations of our countries and in the political parties of our countries. If there were enough civic space for us to participate in the real political life of our countries and in the decision-making process, we would not be here. And so it is true that we need to fight the daily fight, but we also need to fight the long-term fights. And the long-term fight is a political and cultural one. We need to rebuild our culture. We need a cultural renaissance in the MENA region. We are lacking a cultural renaissance today. We are lacking a narrative, a story to tell ourselves, to tell our subconscious, to tell our collective psyche, to tell our children, the next generations, about what it is to be a woman in the MENA region and what it is to have a fair and equal economy. What does it mean? How does it look like? And this is your question today. And it's a question that is being asked by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which just happens to be a foundation related to a German political party. That is what a political party produces. Political parties are important. Political life is important. And part of our struggle is to fight the fight in order to find our place in the political life of our countries. And
Yes.
just the last point, I will just give an example. And I think this is one of, because you also mentioned, how do we incentivize people and women's groups and youth groups and everybody to get into that conversation? That's why culture is important, because we as women's rights and civil society organizations need to look at how to change the discourse in order to make it accessible, but also how to ask the right questions. And part of those right questions is to innovate. And sometimes innovation is can benefit from looking towards the past. And that's what ecofeminism does. Ecofeminism and degrowth are two big themes in the progressive agenda today and in the feminist agenda today. And we need to have a discussion together, ongoing discussion on how to integrate those in our advocacy agenda and our awareness raising agenda, because it has to be also, and maybe before anything else, about long-term cultural and political change.
Yes, thank you so much, Diana. And I'm very aware of the time. We have 2 questions in the question box, and then we have 2 people raising their hands. So maybe we can also keep the answers quite brief, so we can answer to everyone. So Abdul Basit Qayed, and thank you for translating your question, so we can be consistent in the language channel, says, what are the interventions required for the continuation of women's economic empowerment projects and to overcome crisis on the part of policymakers as well as from civil society institutions? Who'd like to answer that?
Maybe I do not, sorry, can I come in? Can you hear me? All right. So actually, maybe I cannot answer the question fully, or I cannot answer the part that actually says, I mean, what are the interventions required for the continuation of women empowerment in general, but to rather answer what we should not be doing. Because lately, there has been a trend, which is that we have been seeing people trying to scale up informal forms of social protection that and informal forms of solidarity that women have created for themselves and that some communities have created for themselves. This, I mean, I can see why this is happening. It is happening because the states are absent, and the states are not willing to work, are not willing to politically speaking, they do not have the political will to do the needed policy interventions, and they do not have probably the means, financial and other governance means, to be able to help these women. Therefore, people are resorting to community-led initiatives. They are resorting to their own forms of solidarity and of social protection. This can be I mean, good on the short in the short run. It can be good as a direct response to a particular crisis, but it risks us falling into 2 main problems. First of all, the states will just rely on the people, will rely on the coping mechanisms on the people. And here they will start abusing the term resilience, which we in Lebanon hate for that particular reason that I'm mentioning. So that is one. The second problem which we might be facing is that these forms of informal social protection in Tunisia, I was trying to mention that and I didn't have time to continue. It's like not benign at all, because people are busy making a living. They are busy putting bread on the table and finding livelihood means, that they are resorting to unfair forms of work and income sources that are really unfair. For example, they are trying to sell crafts and to sell very small gadgets that are considered by tourists, that are considered by elitist people as oriental, but they are selling them at a very, very low cost, and they don't know that these people are reselling them at second hand at a very much higher cost. So they are not actually benefiting from anything. And this is because there is a lack of supervision, and there is a lack of the state of law more broadly that one of our attendees have mentioned in the chat box. This lack is making even those informal forms of social protection just be not successful. And here I'd like to highlight this as a key deliberate element that our states are resorting to, because they are trying to create a social implosion after the revolution, after the uprising that has happened in Lebanon, in Tunisia, even in Sudan. That we can see a sort of a social implosion followed by social inertia, because people are busy taking it day by day, putting bread on the table, that they are not protesting, that they are not actually raising their voice and demanding and speaking up their grievances and their struggles and daily sufferings. And I would like to also reiterate something, or actually re-emphasize something that Yana mentioned, which is that in some cases, women are just okay with what's happening. It's either that they are okay with that, or that they don't know about their rights because they need more awareness raising, and more importantly, they need more education. And some of them are also not collaborative enough with the practitioners and with the researchers who are approaching them, trying to help them, because they lost trust. And because this state citizenship relationship and the lack of trust that they have lost towards their state is projecting on so many levels, including on the level of NGOs, of practitioners and of researchers who are trying to approach them, to listen to them, and to also help them. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. We have also another question from Emna Samiri, and I guess you answered this question to a large extent, but she asks more specifically on economic protection. So she says, it is obvious that the gender effects of the COVID-19 crisis highlighted the uneven progress towards gender equality. Yes. So what should we do as feminists to push our governments to provide economic protection? Also, Diana, if you
strike is good. Striking is good. I'd like not much to add, except maybe one point is again, be political in the sense that strategically, many times, I'll give an example that is not economic, but I think is very illustrative. When sometimes we're pushing for women's quota in parliamentary elections. A lot of organizations end up working with all political parties because the point is boiled down to what is an indicator, and that is sometimes like the danger of indicators. What is the percentage of women in leadership positions or as candidates or local representatives from each political party? But is that really the point? Do I want women to be represented at all costs in any political party? What if that political party is really anti-feminist, patriarchal, has nothing to do with my feminist agenda? Why would I want to empower women in that political party? Let's get political again. It's very important, and it's very important to understand the political economy of the political life of each country, of the economic life of each country. And whenever you want to push your governments to adopt a certain reform, understand who are the key players in that policy process, who are affecting it, what are the interests at play. And this is why I would go back to a point I mentioned, which is trade unions, trade unions, trade unions. It is key, crucial for feminist movements to have strong alliances with trade unions. Look at the case of Tunisia. Trade unions, the more powerful, the strongest they are, the more they can impact the policy process. So there is one key answer on how to affect the policy process in your country. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Diana. Iman Abdulrahman, if you are still here and you would like to ask your question, please go ahead.
معاكم. يسعد مساكم جميعا ويعطيكم العافية. موضوع كتير مهم إنه نحن نتناقش فيه. معلش بدي بس تعطوني مساحة صغيرة، يمكن أكون بحكي إشي مختلف تماماً بالرؤية اللي أنتم عم تحكوا فيها. أنا بالنسبة لي أهداف التنمية المستدامة في يعني كوفيد بموضوع كورونا بالذات يعني أثبت عوار أهداف التنمية المستدامة اللي كانت بتحكي وزي أغنية إنه إحنا لن نترك أحد خلفنا في الركب، رح نحقق التنمية المستدامة. ولكن للأسف الشديد أهداف التنمية المستدامة لم تحقق أقل القليل في أثناء الجائحة وفي أزمة الجائحة، سواء في الصحة، التعليم، الاقتصاد، الفقر اللي بخص النساء، العنف الذي المبني على النوع الاجتماعي، الحيز العام والحيز الخاص للنساء وكل المنظومة بشكل عام. احنا كمجتمع عربي بعتقد انه بديش اضلنا نقول في خصوصيه على الرغم انه في إلنا خصوصيه. يا جماعه الاهداف مش عم بتحقق، والنساء هي الحلقه الاضعف سواء في الحرب او في السلم او في الازمات. طيب احنا كنساء بنحكي، انا بدي احكي بصوت النساء الضعيفات اللي مش قادرين يوصلوا للبانل او للاجتماعات اللي احنا بنعملها خلال الزوم. طيب ايش احنا عملنا؟ كيف يمكن وضع أهداف تناسب المجتمعات العربية والنساء؟ هاي نقطة. النقطة الثانية، إحنا بنحكي على فكرة قبل شوي من الزميلات اللي بتحكي على البانل بتقول على النساء الدخول في المعترك السياسي. طيب كيف؟ طيب الإشي المشيوف في العالم العربي بتقدر تلمسيه. أنا دخلت على موضوع الانتخابات في فلسطين، تمام؟ في أشياء غير مرئية هي عبارة عن عراقيل ومعيقات لدخول النساء في المعترك السياسي. النساء محتاجة لدعم مالي ومادي ومعنوي حتى من المؤسسات النسوية والأطر النسوية والمجتمع من حولها. لما بتنزل على الانتخابات بتلاقيش هذا الشيء موجود. أنا بدي تركيبة معينة نتفق عليها ونحكي عليها. بدنا نكون إحنا صوت النساء، مش مجرد إحنا جايين على بانل بنحكي في الصورة المثالية اللي ممكن تكون. بدنا نغوص مع الناس، بدنا نشوف نبض الشارع العربي وثقافته، الخطاب اللي بنحكي فيه وطريقة تقبل المجتمع له. يعني أنا بدي أحكي عن فلسطين وسيداو وعن الجندر اللي أنا مدربة فيه، واللي كنا يقولوا مساواة نقول عدالة اجتماعية عشان يكون متقبل، والعدالة تشمل كل شيء تحت مظلتها. لازم يكون الخطاب مختلف. لازم إحنا نتعامل نشوف القاعدة الجماهيرية من النساء اللي هي أكلت الضرب في موضوع الكوفيد وهي داخل البيت، والعنف اللي أسقط عليها من جميع الاتجاهات. الاقتصاد كتير مهم، هو تدمر اقتصاد النساء اللي هم صاحبات المشاريع الصغيرة والمتناهية الصغر. أنا لن أجمل القبيح، أنا بحكي في صورة واقعية، سواء في فلسطين، في تونس، في المغرب، في لبنان. الوضع العام السياسي كمان شو عم بفرز لنا. يعني إحنا مش لحالنا في الميدان، في كتير عوامل. يا جماعة لازم إحنا نكون صادقين مع حالنا عشان ننقل الصورة للنساء، عشان نتحرر من الإشي اللي إحنا عم نحكي فيه. أنا من وجع بحكي، لأن دخلت معترك الحياة السياسية ما فيش مجال. أنا إنسانة مستقلة، ما لقيت حدا يدعمني عشان أطلع. بصيرش أضلني أحكي النساء. أنا حتى عاتبت المؤسسات النسوية الفلسطينية وقلت لهم ما ينفعش نضلنا نقول وين النساء، طب افتحوا لنا المجال، طب ادعمونا، طب شو هي الآلية اللي ممكن أنا أطلع فيها كإنسانة حابة تخدم بلدها وتخدم النساء معاها. في كتير أشياء ممكن نحط إيدنا على الوجع ونقول من هون بدنا نبلش. أنا متأسفة كتير، بس أنا يعني من اللي شايفاه وعايشاه في الميدان حبيت أنقل الصورة. يعني أنا عندي جروب اسمه حكايات النساء، نساء عندهم مشاريع اقتصادية. أنا بحاول بإيد لحالها أضوي على مشاريعهم، أصور المعارض، أنزل. عملت اتفاقية مع الإعلام يضوي على هدول النساء، بس إيد لحالها ما بتكون. والنساء محتاجات كمان دعم مالي، مش بس إنه يعني هم مش عارفين يسوقوا. أوكي، بس أنا كإيمان كإنسان بتشتغل تطوع في مؤسستها ما بتقدر تشيل. طب إيش الحل يا صبايا؟ يعني أنا حابة أسمع منكم شو الحل في أهداف التنمية المستدامة اللي هي أثبتت عوارها؟ شو الحل في موضوع مشاركتنا السياسية وكيف ندعم بعض؟ شو الحل في موضوع الاقتصادي؟ شو الحل في موضوع الفقر؟ شو الحل في موضوع التعليم؟ يعني عن جد وجع 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 النساء بتعاني منه. وبدناش نضلنا نجمل القبيح، بدناش نضلنا نصيب الأشياء هيك سطحي، لا بدنا نغوص في عمقها وبدنا نوضع حلول. بترجاكم، يعني أنا دائما بقول بدنا نبدأ من هون، ويعني شو ممكن إحنا نشتغل مع بعض. يا ريت يا ريت يا ريت يا ريت عشان يتغير حال العالم العربي. شكرا كثير، وسوري إذا أنا أزعجتكم أو إنه كنت نوعا ما حادة.
شكرا جزيلا إيمان، شكرا جزيلا على النظرة على الواقع اللي عطيتها لنا. شكون who wants to answer Iman now quickly?
I can just, I'm going to keep speaking in English. I trust there is interpretation. I'm going to just answer the part related to the SDGs, and I'll leave the political participation comment to Diana. Just regarding the SDGs, I do agree, like definitely the Agenda 2030, which includes the 17 SDGs, is not yet achieved. First of all, we're still in 2022, and probably even progress-wise, we haven't yet achieved them, and we may not achieve that. I do understand. What we were trying to say, or what I was trying to say, is not that the SDGs are the solution. The SDGs are the agenda or the goals that are the ultimate goals that we should be thinking of, and whereby we should be mainstreaming gender. Ideally, optimally, if we implement them, that is good. That is what we want. What you are saying is that they are not being implemented, and that is something else. This does not mean that these goals are not good. These goals are good, and the agenda is very well formulated. But when it comes into practice, even if we look at the voluntary national reviews of the different governments, they are being faked. I mean, they are faking data, they are cooking information because they are lying. So again, the agenda is good, the goals are great, and they are a very important entry point for gender discrimination, for gender equality, if gender is mainstream. But when it comes to implementation, we are not doing well for so many political, economic, and social reasons that we all know. But it's not. I mean, the goals themselves aren't to be blamed. I mean, yeah. Thanks.
أنا رح أحكي بالعربي وكمان كتير بسرعة. يعني إيمان، صرختك ووجعك مفهومين، وبالعكس نتشارك معك فيهم. الموضوع صعب لأنه يعني هي مش قصة مقاربة سطحية للمواضيع قد ما إنه الموضوع المطروح علينا اليوم أكيد فيه كتير من التنظير للأسف. بس نحن بحاجة لاثنين، بحاجة إنه نكون موجودين على الأرض وعم نشتغل على الأرض وعم نكون واقعيين وعم نتساعد نظراً للوضع، للواقع المرير اللي نحن عايشينه، وعم نلاقي حلول فورية. بس كمان بنفس الوقت بحاجة يمكن الناس اللي عندهم الفرصة مثلنا إنه يقعدوا بمكاتبهم ويفكروا شوي، يفكروا كمان بالرؤية المستقبلية اللي هي يمكن شوي بعيدة ويمكن شوي نظرية، بس بحاجة كمان نفكر فيها وما نستسلم للواقع كلياً. فبحاجة أنا بالنسبة لي للنظرتين بنفس الوقت. مشان هيك كثير من الأيام حتى نحن نشتغل عمل مناصرة مع مثل ما كنت عم تقول فرح، أيام كثير مع جهات ما منحبهم، بس عايزين نشتغل هالعمل المناصرة. بس بنفس الوقت عايزين نخلي قدامنا النظرة البعيدة المستقبلية اللي هي لا، بدنا نسترجع السلطة، لأنه السلطة لإلنا. صعب ونظري، بس بدنا نشتغل على هذا الموضوع. مزبوط إنه مشاركة المرأة بالحياة السياسية اليوم ناقصها تمويل، بس السؤال التمويل من وين؟ ما في عنا اليوم تمويل من الدول للحياة السياسية ببلادنا، وهيدي مشكلة عايزين نعالجها وعايزين نضغط سوا لإلها. بس عايزين نبني الوعي السياسي. ومزبوط في كتير من المنظمات اللي بتشتغل على الأرض هي لازم، وكمان هون بحاجة لتمويل وبحاجة لمين يدعمها حتى تكون موجودة على الأرض بالأرياف مش بس بالمدينة، مع النساء يلي عم بتناضل بحياتها اليومية حتى تقدر تكفي. وحتى هيدا الخطاب ما نحكيه بس بين بعض بمكاتبنا وعلى الإنترنت، حتى هيدا الخطاب ينبع من تحت ويحمل معه الأوجاع والمطالب الحقيقية. بس هيدا يعني رسالتي الوحيدة لإلك، إنه مش يعني ما فينا نعتمد نظرة واحدة. مضطرين لأنه وقعنا هالقد مرير نطلع على الأمور بمختلف أوجهها، حتى لو أيام يعني هيك طلعنا عم ننظر. شكرا.
Okay, can we give the floor to Raja Al-Bawabiji, and please keep your question brief and an answer briefer. Raja, if you're still here.
عامر مسموع
The network is really bad.
سامعة أنا كنا
احنا مش نسمعه فيك.
أي موقع يمكن بيكون أفضل. أنا عندي بس تسمعوني بوضوح رجاء إنه تقولوا لي. هيك
توا
مسموع.
نسمع فيك بوضوح.
هيك مسموع.
نعم مسموع.
تمام. أنا عندي بس يعني كل الشكر وكل التقدير وكل الاحترام للخبرات وللي قدمتوه، وهذا شيء يعني يحتسب إنه أفضل من السكوت عن السياسات اللي بدها تكون تعالج أو بدها تكون مصححة للأوضاع بعد كورونا. أنا عندي نقطتين بصفتي خبير حقوق إنسان ومحامية. في تحديين يمكن بدي أضيفهم أو يمكن ذكرتوهم أنا ما سمعتهم. إحنا بنعاني عدم من ضعف أو انعدام مشاركة المرأة في صنع السياسات والاستراتيجيات، وهذا راجع إلى نقطة مهمة اللي هي ضعف وصول المرأة للمراكز القيادية، وبنعاني فيه بكل الشرق الأوسط تقريباً. اثنين، أنا بنتيجة خبراتي بالرصد الميداني لحقوق المرأة بكل المجالات، كان في معاناة للمرأة ذات الإعاقة أثناء كوفيد، وهي بدنا نوليها البرايورتي لما بدنا نحط السياسات. بلس إنه كان عندنا العنف الاقتصادي والاجتماعي وحالات الطلاق والتفكك الأسري كانت شديدة في وقت الكورونا. أيضا هذا الجانب الاجتماعي بيأثر على أدائنا السياسي وعلى حقوقنا. في عندي اقتراحات إذا كان في ناس يعني بدها تضغط لمواقع لأصحاب مواقع صنع السياسات. يمكن حكت زميلتنا فرح أو زميلتنا ديانا إنه الإعفاء الضريبي. أنا بهذا الخصوص كان عندي تحليل قانوني لمؤشرات تنمية مستدامة لحقوق المرأة، فكنت أنا عم أقول بالتوصيات بالتقارير السنوية للمركز الوطني لحقوق الإنسان إنه نعفي أصحاب العمل أثناء فترة الكورونا وما بعد الكورونا اللي بيشغلوا المرأة، سواء كانت ذات إعاقة أو غير ذات إعاقة. يعني زي ما بنعطيهم برسنتج مثلا إعفاء ضريبي شخصي إذا كان مثلا دخلك فيهم كمان 10%، تمام، عشان يشغلوا المرأة ويصير تعافي اقتصادي لأوضاعها. بدي أضيف كمان شغلة يمكن برايورتي من نتائج الرصد الميداني للمزارعات ومالكات الحيازة بالزراعة. عانوا كثير أثناء الكوفيد وعانوا كثير أثناء التغير المناخي. يعني هذا بدعينا إنه نعطيهم أولوية، لأنه هدول المنتجات أو صاحبات المزارع قد ايه عم بيشغلوا ناس. نحن رصدناهم بإقليم الوسط والشمال والجنوب، عانوا كثير أثناء الكوفيد، فالآن التعافي بده يكون لدعمهم. ويمكن أنا بقول في كمان آثار الكلايمت تشينج زادت مع الكوفيد، وهذا بيعينا لأنه نولي الاهتمام لهذا الموضوع، خاصة أنه في بيان للاتحاد العالمي لمؤسسات حقوق الإنسان على أثر الكلايمت تشينج بالإضافة لكوفيد على المرأة ذات الإعاقة. وشكرا كثير.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذة رجاء. بالطبيعة موضوع الكلايمت تشينج والتغير المناخي موضوع هام جدا وعنده علاقة بالاقتصاد بالمرأة في العالم العربي. لو كانوا بس الاقتراحات اللي حبيت تقولهم وما فماش أسئلة، ممكن نتعداو درة من جلجي. Dora, if you're still here, you can ask your question briefly.
Dora, no, we cannot hear you. Dora is asking if we can hear her.
هكا مسموعة؟
مسموعة.
عسلامة الناس الكل. يعطيكم الصحة بالنسبة للويبينار هذايا. أنا حبيت نعمل تدخل بالنسبة في الوضع في تونس مثلا اللي لاحظته إنه الدولة حطت إطار إنه يمكن نجاح الانتربرونورز معناها الشبان وكل شيء كسوا بغض النظر على الجندر من الناحية هذيك الناحية الأولى. حكاية ستارت اب اكت مثلا، ستارت اب اكت اللي هي الدولة تشجع الانتربرونيا، مي بالنسبة مثلا الان جي اوز والبينيفيشيريز نتاعها في نطاق العمل والاجنده معناها الاكتيفيست والا الموظفين في وسطهم، انه الفئه التارجت جروب نتاعنا مثلا انا اون طونك اكس اكتيفيست انهم نساء في وضعيه هشه والا جندر نون كونفورمال بيبل في وضعيه هشه. دونك ما ينجموش حتى يكون التولز نتاع ما عندهمش الاديوكيشن اللازمه والا ادمنستريتيف سكيلز والا المعلومات اللي تنجم انت تاخذهم تحل جوجل وتلقى هاو تو تعمل ستارت اب مثلا ولا مؤسسه، واللي هي ما تنجمش يقعدوا ديما في الايكونومي باراليل في النوار يخدموا. معلش سماح كنت نجم تعاوني بالنسبه
دورة كنت تنجم تقعد في نفس اللغه ما تغيرش اللغه نتاعك، يعني انت تو استعملت 3 لغات، كنت تنجم تحكي بلغه واحده على خاطر عنا المترجمين.
نمشي بالفرنسي ميسالش par rapport à ça, les personnes, que les associations, par exemple, la campagne, c'est des femmes qui sont fragiles ou fragilisées au niveau économique. Donc, de ce côté-là, les outils qu'on met qu'on met pour les empower, pour les supporter ou renforcer leur capacité à produire et à profiter du système mis en place, qui est le système de civilisation. Donc, quand tu es employé ou entrepreneur, il y a les charges sociales, il y a la taxation, etc. Donc, réellement, pour avoir accès, que ce soit à la santé, ou à l'éducation, ou pour faire entrer ses enfants à l'école, il faut être inscrit quelque part. Donc, il faut qu'on voit un peu comment les personnes qui sont démunies, il y a des femmes rurales, par exemple, pas rurales, les personnes qui sont complètement démunies et qui sont la première cible des associations ou des ONG qu'on essaie d'aller vers eux. Donc là, il n'y a pas de mécanisme, une pensée réfléchie dans ce sens-là, où par exemple les associations, moi quand j'étais dedans, c'est plus du service direct en urgence, que ce soit housing, que ce soit par exemple housing, c'est l'hébergement, les femmes victimes de violences, tu vas l'accompagner au poste de police, à l'hôpital, etc. Mais il n'y a pas, par exemple, l'école de la deuxième chance, par exemple, il n'y a pas un accompagnement qui permet que la personne soit autonome et devienne autonome, que ce soit au niveau financier ou pour gérer une boîte, que ce soit gérer elle-même et ses finances. Ça, c'est mon avis de ce que j'ai vu dans la masse, par exemple. Mais je ne sais pas par l'autre. Mais sinon, excellente intervention. Et désolée pour le stress. J'espère que c'était...
Can you have very, very, very brief answers? Very brief answers.
Sinon, pardon, Sameh et les autres. Quelles seraient les politiques des acteurs au niveau international qui médient entre les gros collecteurs, par exemple l'État, les fonds, qui prennent les fonds et par la suite redistribuent? Quelle est la feuille de route? Quelle est l'urgence qui est mise en place? Les axes prioritaires d'intervention des organismes tels que Oxfam, Kvina, IVOS et les grands acteurs, disons, au niveau international? Est-ce qu'il y a une feuille de route claire qui a été bâtie de bottom-up ou pas encore? Ou est-ce que c'est un projet qui est toujours en cours? Voilà, merci.
Merci, Dora.
I can
do you want to start?
Yeah, Diana, did you want? Okay. Okay, so just briefly to go, I mean, so many points, very interesting points and relevant points raised. I'm going to go from the last question till the very first ones. And this actually reinforces what Diana has highlighted several times regarding the need to map, document, analyze, and also mobilize social movements, trade unions, labor unions, but also when we work as civil society organizations, whether local, regional, or international civil society organizations, we need to stop working in a scattered manner. We need indeed to join our efforts, to join forces together to be able to make a better impact. We need to have a coordinated vision because while we have like so many civil society organizations working and think tanks working, we only have very few mechanisms that are available for us to pursue. That's why we need to join forces for us to be able to advance a very stronger and very well articulated and feasible discourse on these levels. So this is regarding the very last question. Regarding women and people with disabilities, especially during COVID, this is something that I indeed mentioned, but probably passing, so that's why it couldn't catch the audience's attention. But this is very, very important in my opinion. We need to take into consideration the intersectionality between gender and these typical forms of vulnerability that we all know of. And we always need, when we're trying to devise policies for women, economic policies for women, we need to always remember that women have particular needs. They have particular needs just by the fact of being women. They have their own specificities. I mean, the increase in the rate of unwanted pregnancies, of hotline calls, of gender-based violence because of the lockdown and because of the economic shock or economic recession is something that we have to stop at and to think of, because of the decrease in social spending, and since governments have dealt with COVID as a health or sanitary crisis and not as an economic crisis, we can see that women could not meet their pregnancy, labor, childbirth, menstruation needs, all of these postpartum needs. They could not meet these, and there is a very big differential loss of livelihoods between them and between men. And I mean, the unwanted pregnancies, if we go back to the reason, because they could not afford buying contraceptives, and they could not afford reaching the needed sexual and reproductive health care. And that is all happened in the absence of mental health support. And this is something very important that we need to address. Even when we're speaking about economic recovery towards women or feminist economic recoveries, we need to talk about mental health, because eventually we need to start thinking about the economic impact on women. And we cannot be dealing with a community that does not have the necessary mental health support, all while facing these social norms and cultural restrictions. I also would like to add, so regarding tax exemptions, this is indeed very important. Maybe not necessarily the way our colleague has mentioned it, maybe not necessarily just the way she mentioned it, but we need indeed to provide incentives to private sector representatives. We cannot ask private sector representatives to do anything without motivating them, without providing them with legal and with financial incentives, because again, they are profit-oriented. So this is something that I would agree on. Regarding the discussion on SDGs and the related discussions, I mean, I would like to also add a point related to data and indicators, and this goes back to my previous point. So indeed, maybe the SDGs are good if we implement them, but at the same time, when we come to measure the implementation or the impact or the achievements that we are doing vis-a-vis the SDGs, we need to rethink the indicators and the sub-indicators that the UN, which is like the custodian entity behind the SDGs that they have put, which are not necessarily reflective of the current realities and which can be misleading. So at some point we could, for example, reach a conclusion that we have achieved goal X, whereas we did not achieve it. Finally, my very last point before I think I would have covered most or like all of the points I think are important is related to the context specificities. We need, as we are devising or as we are setting feminist strategies for economic recovery, we need to be very, very conscious of the context specificities that we are dealing with. In Lebanon, the financial crisis and that is like characterized by currency devaluation and galloping inflation. This has to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, we would be just speaking in a vacuum and proposing unfeasible solutions. In Tunisia, if we are to be realistic, is like following suit to Lebanon. In terms of the monetary or the financial situation, unfortunately. And also Tunisia has its specificity after July 25 and the political crisis. Sudan is passing through a political crisis. Morocco and Jordan on the opposite have a more of a optimistic prognosis, given that in Morocco there is a new development paradigm that was announced. There is a government that is called the social protection or social justice government that we can leverage on, even though it's just empty talks. In Jordan, there is like the social security law, a draft law that is being discussed. In Egypt, there is a labor law and a social insurance law being discussed. And there is a discussion related to the shift in the health system from a free healthcare coverage to another model that is more insurance and private-led, like the Port Said model. All of these discussions, since they are ongoing, we should be focusing on them because they are ongoing. Once they happen, it will be much more difficult for us to take a step back and to go back and to solve them. But because these issues are still in progress, then we can somehow, we have more area to play in and to make an impact in. I think I'm gonna stop here, but I'd like also to highlight one last point, which is that in laws related to the citizenship, for example, the inability of women, female mothers, Lebanese mothers, to give their citizenship to their kids. Just an example. This all has materialized during the COVID pandemic. These very blunt discriminations that we talk about always, when a crisis happens, the impact of these discriminations becomes harsher on women. And it is then that these women feel that they are really, really, really not living in a fair system, in fair nations. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Farah. I think we are now way beyond our dedicated time, and I think it's time to wrap up. And I guess Hadil's question is very important. I guess Farah answered your first part, the first part of your question about are you aware of any cases, real life examples that making an impact that you can share with us? And you've just answered this, Farah. Thank you. And she also says, how can we also dismantle patriarchy, which is the main reason for injustices and inequality? And this is actually the core reason why you are talking about this. Is patriarchy and capitalistic neoliberal systems. I don't know if you have any closing remarks on this, Farah or Diana, and otherwise we can give the floor to Lydia to wrap up and conclude this very interesting webinar that I really personally enjoyed. So, yeah. Diana, if you wanna say anything
no,
about dismantling the patriarchy.
About dismantling the patriarchy, well, first I will thank you, Hadil, for being here. Hadil is our gender coordinator at Oxfam and MENA, and I'm sure she can speak for 2 days about dismantling the patriarchy. but I would just go back to my first point, that the capitalistic system is very much a patriarchal system, and so the struggle is one. And these two struggles need to go hand in hand, and we are all reflecting together. Of course, we cannot give a straight ahead answer, but certainly working on shifting the public discourse around the economic model and raising awareness on why it's unequal, why it's unfair, and how we can change it should go a long way. I will stop here and thank you so much for this panel, for the opportunity to speak.
Farah, any last remarks you want to share with us?
Actually, I'd like to add to what Diana said regarding dismantling patriarchy, which is indeed a very important question. It is probably just one very narrow dimension, but that we often forget about. It is that we need to stop thinking about women as a cohesive or as a homogeneous group. And when we speak about any vulnerable group, and we have so many forms of vulnerability that we agree on, we also need to stop thinking about them as cohesive or homogeneous group, because the more disaggregated our approach is to addressing particular issues, the higher the impact is. So even when we're speaking about patriarchy in the big scheme of things, we also need to be aware of who are we talking about and when, because also we have to admit that when some women are very, very underprivileged, others are very fortunate, are very well off. And we need to use those women who are strong to be able to help those who are not. So yeah, it is. But I mean, in practice, I cannot help more. I'm like, my focus is more like economic development related and public policy related. Sorry. And thank you. Also, I'd like to thank FES. I'd like to thank you, Samah, for this opportunity. And it was indeed a pleasure to be here to listen to Diana's intervention, to all of your interventions, and to interact with the audience and listen to their thoughts and concerns. Thanks so much.
Thank you both for these two brilliant interventions. And I guess thank you very much, FES, for providing another safe space and another very intellectually stimulating, and it's also a networking area through these webinars. And I hope this will translate into practice and into like real life actions. And I think this is also a new step in keeping the discussion alive around equality. So the floor is yours, Lydia, to conclude this webinar. And thank you again, everyone, for attending as well.
Yeah. Exactly. The pleasure is also really here. I really enjoyed Farah's and Diana's inputs. Samah, thank you so much for the moderation. This was indeed very stimulating and inspiring. And also thank you to all the participants here in the online discussion, but also those who joined with the live stream. And the fact that we now half an hour over our envisioned end date shows that this was a really engaging discussion and a very crucial one, and that we, that all of you touched upon very crucial points, and that we could continue much longer because this is such an important dimension. So thank you everyone, and yeah, I was also talking to Zaina here in the chat, because we felt that many of the points that you raised, we were sort of discussing similarly last week in an FES internal workshop. And it's so good to hear that you make the same points and you stress what is important. And one takeaway for me is really this importance where we started off with of shifting our focus and looking more into maybe concepts that last week we called them care economy, where we put the care for the environment, the care for minorities, the care for women into the center, where care work is valued. And where, we shift away from growth to maybe more progression. I really liked that. That is where we are starting also here. That requires first and foremost, and Diana made that point, and Farah made that point, that we need to shift the discourse. But as we made here at the very end of the session very clear, this is not where we can end. We need to, from that discourse shift, then start to work in practice to shift power dimensions, and then to shift the structures. Or maybe the other way around, we first need to shift structures, and that way we also shift power, which would again also be an interesting discussion. But we don't, like, this is obviously a space. It is super interesting to engage, to make these points, what is important, but then action also needs to follow. So I'm leaving this very inspired, but also obviously with a lot of question marks. And I love, though, that we are having this discussion on a day where one of the measures is already taking place right now, which is to strike, to really put this into action and raising awareness by, well, stop everything that we do to show how important our work is to keep the system running, right? And organizing and trade unions and alliances. This is also what I take away from this discussion. And this is something that I'm very happy that we at FES, our team, that is something that we try to work on with our partners. So again, thank you very much, Samha. Thank you very much, Farah. Thank you very much, Diana, but also the whole team which is behind organizing this webinar. It's me talking, but actually the whole organization and preparation is done by my colleagues Zaina and Iman, Amira. So a big, big thank you to all of you for arranging the space, for allowing us to have this discussion further, and for contributing to this. And last but not least, obviously also a big thank you for the interpreters, which your work makes this all also possible to be more inclusive. And I'm so sorry that I only speak English. I hope that this will change eventually in the future. And then last but not least, I'd also like to raise your awareness to the fact that there are 3 or 2 more upcoming webinars, online discussions on, again, feminist strategies for specific areas after the pandemic or this new normal we have to adapt to. And the next one is actually on digitalization. And I like that Farah pointed towards that already as well. So I'd like to encourage you and to invite you all to take part in the next upcoming online discussions. Our Facebook page, both as well as the website that I shared before, will inform you about the exact dates. Thank you very much and have a good evening or afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you. Thank you for all your inputs. Super inspiring.
Thank you, Lydia. Have a lovely rest of the day or evening. Bye.